just wanted to preface this by saying that everything in this video essay falls under fair use. That means it's okay to use all of these clips and songs and sound bites so long as they fall underneath the category of criticism, education, entertainment, etc. Clearly, I do not own New Line Cinema or the Final Destination franchise. That all belongs to, as mentioned before, Paramount and New Line. I have an immense love of horror movies that began around my sophomore year of high school. To be clear, I've always been a massive film nerd, or at least I have been since I watched Titanic for the first time at 3 years old, or later that same year watching Transformers for the first time. The latter experience was life-changing, to say the least, but that's a story for another video. You see, the reason it took me until I was 15 or so to really start appreciating horror cinema is that, quite frankly, it scared the shit out of me. Now look, I already hear you saying, but isn't that the point of horror movies? Well, yes, and my little brain couldn't handle it. Horror movies gave me elaborate nightmares and made me extremely uneasy as a child. One of my earliest memories is being exposed to The Exorcist as a toddler, and subsequently slowly tiptoeing past my mother's bed every time I had to walk through her room out of fear that it might start violently convulsing in the same way that it does in the movie. Or around the same time, 2007 or so, the movie Dead Silence came out, and even being in a room that had the same eerie blue lighting as this movie was enough to make me want to piss my pants. And you know, despite all of this genuine anxiety that these films elicited within my young imagination, my parents were always at least able to remind me that they were all just films, works of fiction made for a wide audience. There are no monsters in my closet, no telepathic 17-year-olds with a thirst for vengeance. None of it was real. This always comforted me, and eventually as I got older, I was able to come to terms with these films, and around 13 is when I actually became truly capable of watching and enjoying most horror movies. See, as it turns out, my parents' constant reminders that scary movies aren't real and that I'm safe from what I see on screen is exactly what made these films that I'm about to discuss today uniquely horrifying. To me.
That's a good sign. Younger the better. Be a fucked up god to take down this place. A really fucked up god. It was an accident.
Death. No, there are no accidents, no mishaps, and no escapes. What you have to realize is that we're all just a mouse that a cat has by the tail.
Whether you realize it or not, humans are extremely vulnerable beings, just biologically. We are really squishy and fleshy, and unfortunately, we often surround ourselves with things that are sharp, pointy, and hard. Without us really even noticing, everyday life has the potential to be incredibly dangerous. Honestly, it's a good thing that our brains are fairly adept at protecting themselves from becoming a nervous wreck over life's various mundane hazards. However, this particular film franchise seems hell-bent on capitalizing on disrupting this protection. The year is 1997. Screenwriter Jeffrey Reddick, cool name by the way, has aspirations of scripting an episode of The X-Files entitled Flight 180, which follows the story of a man named Charles, who has a nightmarish premonition of his flight crashing, which inevitably ends up coming into fruition. Eventually, Reddick decides to pitch his concept to Paramount Studios. They were very impressed and urged him to pursue turning it into a feature film. The rest, of course, was history. 2000's Final Destination is a unique horror film. Despite the franchise's reputation as a teenage schlockfest filled with ridiculous slapstick-level violence, mostly as a result of the lackluster fourth installment, which could warrant its own video, the first film still manages to stand out 21 years later as a uniquely entertaining experience. But what is it about this film that managed to get under my skin so much in particular? Let's dive into it. Right from the jump, the moment the film begins, you are hit with eerie, macabre imagery, monsters, demons, the plague, hanging skeletons, etc., all backed by Shirley Walker's magnificently spooky score. Immediately, the film presents as a bit lifeless and cold, which works to its benefit. As soon as the credits end and we meet our main protagonist, 17-year-old Alex Browning, it is established that he's kind of a nervous wreck. He's on the cusp of his senior trip to Paris and is insistent on keeping a tag on his luggage for luck, as he is sure it will keep the plane from crashing. His mom then quickly rips it off. His dad then reminds him to enjoy his trip because, quote,
You got your whole life ahead of you.
these are the first few examples of eerie foreshadowing that will eventually become a franchise staple. Done to perfection come the gymnastics scene in the 5th installment. It's hard to put into words here, but like everything that's happening to the characters on screen already feels so distant. There's a detachment here. Everything that's happening to Alex is outside of his control despite what he might wish. I feel like the shot of his mom ripping off the tag is important because it makes Alex even more vulnerable. No longer does he have the idea of this lucky shield protecting him. From this moment, both he and the audience are defenseless and uneasy. I know all of this seems very specific and the door is blue, blah 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 blah, but I promise I'm getting at something here. Essentially, the point that I'm trying to make is that the elements that make these movies so scary is that the very foundation of their horror is already present within the first 5 minutes of the first film. After this interaction, Alex goes to bed and we are treated with yet more unsettling imagery of toy skeletons hanging in his window and ominous shots of model aviation illuminated by the lightning of a thunderstorm. At the end of this scene is a close-up shot of his alarm clock that reads 1 a.m. However, the first 0 resembles an 8, making it look like 180. His flight number. The number 180 eventually becomes one of Death's many calling cards throughout the series. Let's backpedal a bit. We are only 4 minutes and 54 seconds into the movie, and already Death has established itself as a larger-than-life, omnipresent threat, and we haven't even seen it yet. We kind of never will, but that's another thing. It's vaguely ambiguous as to whether or not all these little signs mean anything, which leads to both Alex and the audience to question their sanity for a while as the movie continues. In the same way that a 5-year-old in his dark room will stare at his coat rack, trying to convince himself that it's not a tall, faceless figure staring back at him. This movie elicits that uneasy feeling in your gut that something is about to go wrong and toys with it for an hour and 38 minutes. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a bit in the story so I can get to the main gist of what I'm trying to say with this essay. Basically, he gets to the airport and we meet his best friend Todd Wagner. Todd, not so coincidentally, means death in German. School jock Carter Horton and his girlfriend Terry Chaney. Class clown Billy Hitchcock. And last, but certainly not least, quiet weird girl Clear Rivers, who bears a striking resemblance to my friend JD. Hi JD. Something one might notice whilst viewing this film is just the jarring lack of levity throughout. Moments where characters are joking around or laughing with each other are overlaid by Walker's bone-chilling musical score. These characters are blissfully unaware of what they're about to get into, and they're laughing on the way to their doom. For whatever reason, that aspect of the movie still gives me the creeps to this day. Eventually, Alex is finally on the plane. Despite being a nervous wreck, he is eventually able to calm down a bit and brace for takeoff. The plane begins to lift, and the passengers all seem very excited. All the while, the music is building in tension. The film seems to take some sick glee in forcing the audience to watch helplessly. Anyway, shortly after taking off, the plane explodes, killing everyone on board immediately. The end. Just kidding. Yeah, no, I'm just getting started. The plane does blow up and everyone on board does die. However, Alex wakes up. It was all a premonition. He freaks out and urges everybody to get off the flight because he knows it's about to crash. Long story short, he, his classmates, and his teacher, Valerie Luton, are all kicked off the flight due to his disruptive behavior, much to their behest. Yada yada yada, Carter and Alex get into a spat, and then boom. The plane actually crashes. This, of course, kicks off the plot of the movie. It might just be my favorite setup for any movie, period, not just horror. I love how much tension builds from the moment we meet Alex Browning to the moment the plane actually explodes. As a child, this wasn't something my parents could explain away to me as just a movie. People die every day, and death itself is completely indifferent to whomever it preys upon. Now that I feel as though in analyzing the opening of the first film, I've been able to set the basis of what makes the entire franchise work, in reanalyzing the other films, I've been able to compromise a list of the top 4 elements that work together to make Final Destination truly terrifying. Element number 1, voyeuristic camera. The deaths are shot as if we were watching everything unfold and are still helpless to do anything about it. As I mentioned previously, this distance between the film and the audience creates an uneasiness. It feels like you're witnessing something happen in real time. For the most part, the death scenes are shot in brilliant HD lighting. From the moment a death sequence begins, you already understand that you're about to see whatever is going to happen to these characters in full gory detail. Now, anyone familiar with show versus tell knows that this typically takes away from the horror of the sequence. This is why you don't really see much of the shark in Jaws. However, oftentimes the death that plays out on screen tends to be far less grisly than the ones implied by the context of the scene. This allows your imagination to go haywire and cause you to expect the worst. This is what makes sequences like Evan's death in the second movie so hard to sit through. The third aspect that contributes to the horror of these movies is the sound design. As a child watching these films, my first defense was to close my eyes and look away. However, these movies make sure that this is ineffective. Even when you look away from the screen, you can still hear the carnage, which is arguably scarier. Don't believe me? Listen to this clip from Final Destination 3. In the fifth installment. This is one scene that I still can't really stomach. It took me a lot even to edit this clip into the video. Last but not least is the cherry on top, plausibility. Every death that happens in the franchise is a freak accident that can and has occurred in real life. Freddy Krueger isn't real, but faulty pool drains are. And that is scary.